For our next speaker, we have Kate Wofford. Kate is the Executive Director of the Shenandoah Valley Network, having held that position since 2009. Her work mostly includes maintaining healthy and productive rural landscapes and communities to protect and restore natural resources, and to strengthen and sustain the region's agricultural economy. Before joining SVN, Kate was the Director of Conservation for the Wood River Land Trust in Hailey, Idaho. Kate is a South Carolina native. She holds a degree from Washington and Lee University in Lexington and Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Sciences. Please join me in welcoming Kate.
Thank you, Brett, and thanks to Mr. Solheimer and Jason for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to just start out by acknowledging the extraordinary work that VOF has done in Virginia. I think the resources that have been protected here in Virginia, the working farms and forest land and the wildlife habitat, clean water, is really astonishing. We're so proud when people come visit us in Virginia and we can show them the just astonishing Virginia countryside. And VOF has played a major role in that, and I really applaud you and encourage you to keep it up. A second smaller thank you is for holding this panel today. This is obviously an issue that people are worried about and are concerned about and thinking about, and so the opportunity for us to talk about it and for you to continue to refine your policy, I think, is wise and not always easy and comfortable, so I'm glad you're doing it. Before I get started, I want to take a minute to get into a definition, I think, that will help, or has helped me as working on this issue over the last few years. The word fracking itself is confusing, and I think it's caused some sort of unnecessary miscommunication among people in the industry and the general public. Generally, people who work in oil and gas development, people in the industry, engineers, people who do this stuff for a living, when they use the term fracking, they mean the act of hydraulic, the single act of fracking the well, which Mr. Ward showed a slide that said that takes 2 to 5 days. I've seen figures that are a little bit bigger than that, but generally that's a short part of the process, actually fracturing the well. It also refers to a process that's been around since the 1940s, developed by Halliburton. Apparently more than 90% of wells are fracked, even drinking water wells are fracked sometimes. So that's how the industry and people in oil and gas development use the term. When people like me use the term fracking in the general public, we're talking about this entire process of unconventional oil and gas development. We're talking about from when you begin to explore looking for wells and the entire process, the truck traffic and the impact on communities, all the way to what do you do with the polluted water at the end. And one way to say that would be high volume hydraulic fracturing with horizontal drilling and unconventional shale and oil gas formations. But if I have to say that dozens of times over the next half hour, it will be cumbersome. So I'm going to use the term modern fracking, and I actually stole that from the state geologist David Spears. He and I were on a panel together a few weeks ago, and this new fracking, which has caused this energy boom that we're having, which has caused the shale gas boom in the Marcellus Shale and other parts of the country, is really driven by new technology. It's advancements in technology that are significantly different than fracking of the past. So modern fracking is the definition, is the word that I'm going to use, and I'm going to mean in this new form of fracking and all of the impacts associated with it. I've got about 30 minutes, and the first thing I'm going to do is to quickly tell you the story of the Shenandoah Valley and how communities and elected officials in the valley have responded to the prospect of Marcellus shale gas drilling in the valley. Show you some slides from those fact-finding trips from citizens and elected officials in the valley. And then for my last few minutes, I'm going to change hats, and I'm going to give you a little bit of my perspective from my previous position, which was as the stewardship director and then the director of conservation for a land trust, and get a little bit more to VOF's mission. So with that, In 2010, Rockingham County considered what would have been the first permit for modern fracking in Virginia. At the time, there were about 13,000 acres leased in Rockingham County. This map is the northwestern corner of Rockingham County, so this is the state line with West Virginia. Here is the city of Harrisonburg and I-81 to orient you a little bit. And here was the proposal for the first well. It was essentially approved by DMME, but in order to be issued, it needed a local zoning permit. And so the Board of Supervisors in Rockingham County was considering whether or not to issue this local zoning permit. In addition to the 13,000 acres leased in Rockingham, a couple thousand acres were leased in Frederick County, west of Winchester. And another 12,000 acres were leased as part of the George Washington National Forest. So it was a public land lease in mostly in Highland County and a little bit in Augusta County. So that's west of Stanton, for those of you who don't know this part of the state very well. Just to give away the end of the story right off the bat, the supervisors declined to issue this permit. And the company that applied for the permit is Carrizo, based out of Houston. They announced last year that they are not renewing these 5-year leases. So the leases that were signed were for 5 years, and the gas companies had the opportunity to re-up for 5 more years. And last year the company announced that they are not going to renew the leases going back to Houston or going to West Virginia or other places. And they cited 3 reasons for that. One is low gas prices. Another is the poor performance from a well that they had drilled in West Virginia nearby, so the well did not produce as much as they had hoped it would. And the third reason is local resistance. And so I'm going to spend a few slides showing you sort of from whence came the local resistance. At the same time as Rockingham County supervisors and communities were considering this private land permit, the George Washington National Forest, which you all probably know and love, 1 million acres of public land, it's the biggest national forest in the East, is updating its forest management plan. It's something that national forests have to do by law every 10 to 15 years. And the timing was just a coincidence. They're updating their forest plan the same time that Rockingham County is considering this private land drilling permit. Well, the entire George Washington National Forest is underlain by Marcellus Shale. I should have said at the beginning, we in Virginia are at the very eastern edge of the Marcellus Shale. So the shale really extends, in the newest USGS maps, it extends really just to the edge here of the valley and goes down. The most productive parts of the Marcellus Shale, of course, are in West Virginia and Pennsylvania and southern New York. But we are indeed on the eastern edge of it, and the entire GW is underlain by Marcellus shale geology. So this is a big question for the George Washington National Forest in their forest plan decision, whether or not they're going to allow modern fracking on the George Washington National Forest. And this is a big issue of concern among folks in the valley and folks beyond that don't live in the valley. What would that do to the public lands of the George Washington National Forest if fracking is allowed? And so in response to this decision, 10 localities have weighed in, and they've sent letters or adopted resolutions that they've sent to the Forest Service supporting what the Forest Service initially proposed, which was a ban on horizontal drilling. And not to get too long into this topic, but their proposed ban on horizontal drilling was their way at getting at this modern fracking. So why are these 10 localities skeptical of fracking on the GW National Forest? And why did Rockingham County officials decline to issue the special use permit? In my mind, a really big reason is the industrial impact of modern fracking. This image, I think Kim Sandham took this picture. Kim is here from Rockingham County. I see her sitting in the audience. She went on a trip with Rockingham County officials to visit modern fracking in Wetzel County, West Virginia. This image shows the extent of a well pad, an industrial operation. Here's a well that I visited also in Wetzel County. This is in the Wetzel Wildlife Management Area. It's a state It's a state protected area. And the reason that we were able to get into this site is because it is public land. So we hiked in up this mountain. And this is a trail that shows on the maps that goes right through here. It's obviously no longer being enjoyed by the public, but that is a walking trail and gives you a sense of what a drill site looks like. Here's an image, the next county south from Wetzel County, which is in the northwestern part of West Virginia, so the opposite side of the state from us. Doddridge County is the next county south. Also a lot of modern fracking going on in Doddridge County. Chris Bolgiano, some of you may know, she's a conservation easement donor. She lives in Rockingham County, and she took a trip about a year ago with a group called Wild Virginia, who took some folks to see fracking firsthand. And this is Chris's image, and I think it really shows the impact on the landscape when you have this kind of drilling going on. This is the same drill site at night. And towards the end of my slides, I'll show you an image. It's really tragic. 3 months after these folks were visiting this well site in Doddridge County, there was a tragic explosion at this very site, and they camped just a few hundred feet from the site in someone's yard. And 2 of the workers were killed on this site, so it was tragic. One of the things that really distinguishes modern fracking from conventional gas drilling of the past is the intensive use of water. This is an image of a water pump that Kim took from Wetzel County, and it's my cue to tell you about how the sourcing of this water is really a thing that communities need to think about if this is something that might be coming to them. Because there are documented cases of gas companies just putting one end of this pipe into these high mountain streams and literally sucking the streams dry. Trout Unlimited has gotten involved in this issue primarily for this reason and also for some water contamination reasons, because often these high mountain streams are the best trout habitat, and trout don't do well when their creek goes dry. In addition to pumping the water out of streams, there are storage reservoirs. I've asked folks in areas where this is going on, when you see these images, are you seeing the freshwater ponds or the wastewater ponds? And often they can be used for both. So they'll initially store the freshwater, and then subsequently wastewater will be used. And Mr. Ward made a great point about recycling. It's really difficult, apparently, to figure out what to do with this highly contaminated wastewater that comes back up out of the well. For a while in Pennsylvania, companies were running it through the municipal wastewater treatment plants. Before that, this is several years ago at the beginning of the boom. Wastewater treatment plants for a municipality clearly are not set up to handle this kind of highly polluted waste that's coming up from a couple miles underground mixed with the cocktail of chemicals. And so the same stuff that was going in one side of the wastewater treatment plant was coming right back out of the other side. And that's something that we need to watch in Virginia, because in Pennsylvania, it was determined that this was happening. Companies agreed to stop sending so much of their wastewater to wastewater treatment plants. It's still going on a little bit, apparently, but that has really scaled back. So now, since companies can't send this polluted wastewater to wastewater treatment plants, they've got to figure out what to do with it. Many companies are trucking it to deep injection wells in Ohio, because the geology in Pennsylvania and West Virginia can't necessarily support these deep injection wells for the wastewater. And the USGS has linked that deep water injection with some earthquakes that have been occurring. So when you hear about the earthquakes, it sounds a bit far-fetched. It's not necessarily to do with fracking itself, but it's to do with this injection into these deep water wells. So since it's so hard to figure out what to do with this wastewater, it has really stimulated a lot of recycling. And the downside of this recycling is that you have this wastewater that gets continually more concentrated with the pollutants and continually more contaminated. And it's often in these holding ponds. And so when you have a failure of a holding pond like this with this highly contaminated waste, it's even more concerning for people that live nearby or drink the water. We also had an opportunity to go up to Washington County, Pennsylvania, which is another place where the modern fracking has been booming over the last few years, south of Pittsburgh. And this is an image of water for fracking in Washington County, Pennsylvania, and a couple of tanker trucks. Which leads me to the next point, that why I believe that people in the Shenandoah Valley are skeptical of fracking on the George Washington National Forest and concerned about it on private land as well. Just the intensive truck traffic. Trucks are a part of life. We all live with trucks. Initially, when I was learning about this and people talked about the truck traffic, it didn't seem like a big deal to me. And then I went to Wetzel County, West Virginia, and tried to imagine what it would feel like to live amongst this relentless truck traffic. And it truly does feel like the entire part of the county, it was the northern part of the county where the fracking's going on, is an industrial site, a construction site. So I think the parallel with a construction site is a good one. But if your construction site is a third of your county, and that's where you live and your schools are and your community is, then it's a much bigger impact than building a house or building a new neighborhood. It's also real hard on the roads. You hear about crumbling roads under the weight of the truck traffic. And you also have accidents that come along with this kind of truck traffic. Ed Wade is a citizen in Wetzel County, and if you are interested in images like this, there are literally hundreds on his website. It's the Wetzel County Action Group, and they have almost every day there's a truck over the side of the road or some incident in Wetzel County. To give you a sense of what living there is like, school buses have escorts because of these narrow mountain roads and the heavy amount of big rigs and water trucks and drill rigs coming in and out. It was determined that the school buses need escorts to avoid contact. Yeah. Another impact on the landscape is pipelines, and the Nature Conservancy published a study appeared in a peer-reviewed journal just a week ago that discusses the impact of modern fracking relative to conventional gas drilling. And it was a researcher from the University of Wyoming and researchers from the Nature Conservancy. And in that study, it is very clear that the impacts on the land from modern fracking, from Marcellus shale gas drilling, are more severe than the impacts on the land from conventional gas drilling. So the footprint of modern fracking is bigger than the footprint of conventional gas drilling. And that is confusing at first, because if you can go such a long distance horizontally, deep underground, you would think that the footprint of this new fracking would be smaller. But it turns out, if you look at the data, that's not the case. And part of that is because of the intensive use of water. So the roads and the trucking and the water that comes in, the pipelines, the compressor stations, the processing plants, all the infrastructure that goes into modern fracking creates a bigger footprint on the landscape, more habitat fragmentation than the drilling of the past. Another impact of another shot of pipelines in Washington County, and I could show you dozens of pipeline images, which I deleted out of my presentation so I could email it to Jason last night. Here's another image from a state forest in Pennsylvania, which shows the fragmentation that occurs when this kind of activity happens in forest land. One of the earliest slides I showed you was the one when we hiked into the Wetzel County Wildlife Management Area. This is an image from right below that site. So we hiked up the mountain, and on the top of this ridge is where the drill pad was. It's the one where there was the hiking trail going through. So there were about 6 drainages coming down off of that ridge, and we walked around the circumference. We were allowed to walk around again because it was public land. Most sites you can't get onto, but this one happened to be on public land, so we could get onto it. We walked around that ridge, and of the 6 drainages that were coming off of that ridge, all of them had blown out, essentially. And this is the creek on one side. The creek used to be right here, but because of the severe erosion that happened on that well pad, it had pushed the creek over to the side. This is my colleague, Sarah Francisco, an attorney at Southern Environmental Law Center, who many of you may know has been working extraordinarily well on the George Washington National Forest issue for years. She and I took this trip to Wetzel County together. Here's another image, and that's Ed Wade, the person who took all those truck pictures. If you like trucks over the side of the road pictures, he's your man. This shows what's happened below that well site. And here, I think this one illustrates it best maybe. So up here is the shot that I showed you where we hiked in on that ridge. There were 6 of these, and then the creeks below were totally blown out, of course. And what happened, as it was explained to us, is that this is a competitive industry. The companies are making a lot of money, and they're competing with each other. And so they get in there fast and get their wells in fast. And when you put a well on top of a ridge like that, and you do it fast, they're often poorly engineered. And then you get a big rain event, and you can have the whole side of a hill or the side of a mountain slump off into the headwater creek below. It is regulated. This isn't legal, but the penalties to companies for these types of violations apparently are not punitive enough to encourage them to follow the regulations. So there may have been a fine because of this, or there may not. But what we've been told is that those fines don't necessarily prevent them from doing the same thing again on the next well site. Again, I mentioned all the infrastructure that goes in. So the well pad itself may be 3 to 5 acres, but the footprint on the landscape may be more like 15 or 20 acres. You hear a lot about the water contamination issues and people whose water is at risk and the water use, and those are all legitimate. But what seems to be emerging over the last year or two is that air quality and the impacts to air quality from modern fracking may actually be more severe than what has been experiencing in the water on the water side. And there's more study. EPA is working on some new regulations on air. There's a lot of new data on the impacts to air, but that's another thing to consider that you don't hear about as much, is the impacts to air. So this is the tragic accident that happened at the site. The Wild Virginia group visited this particular well site, and this is an image from their host that exploded. So if there's members of the audience that are interested in seeing this firsthand, and I'll warn you that I had a stomachache for a week when I got back from Wetzel County, imagining what if this came to the Shenandoah Valley. But Wild Virginia is hosting another one of these tours. It's in about a month. I don't remember the exact date, but if it's something that you'd be interested in doing, it's on their website. It's Wild Virginia. There's camping involved, so be warned. But the people that went on the trip, I think it was really educational for them. So if that's what you're into, check it out. And so these 2 slides show that accidents happen. Of course, no matter what industry you're in, things don't always go as planned. When we were in Washington County, Pennsylvania, our hosts there, who were local elected officials, who were actually pro-gas development, but they were very concerned about the way that it was happening, the pace that it was happening, and the fact that the gas companies were getting so far ahead of local governments and local regulations and landowners. One of our hosts had just taken this image right before we arrived. There was a wastewater pit of one of the holding ponds that had failed. Apparently, the gas company told the regulator that it was the equivalent of a 55-gallon drum, and they would get it out and it would be no problem. And they were required to test the soil, take a truckload out of contaminated soil and test the soil until it tested clean. And it's a bit difficult to tell the scale from this image, but the trucks were still taking out truckloads of contaminated soil when this image was taken. So it's clearly quite a bit more than a 55-gallon drum, and it shows that accidents happen, and they can be severe when they do. The slides that I've shown so far, I think, describe the known impacts of modern fracking, the things that you can dispute about the extent of them, and you can dispute about the benefits of gas production versus these impacts on the ground. But the fact that it's an industrial process and it changes the landscape is indisputable. That is just a fact. The unknown facts are the things that are unknown are these questions of groundwater contamination, methane migration. These are, there's a huge amount of debate on these questions. But for good reason, these tend to be the things that the public is most concerned about. Is this going to contaminate the groundwater? Is this going to contaminate our streams? And back to the definition of fracking from the industry side and the engineer side is that act of actually fracturing the well. I think if you go back to the quotes from Lisa Jackson and the head of the Department of the Interior that say that we don't know of any cases of fracking causing harm to water, read closely, because she says fracking itself and he says fracking per se. Well, they're talking about fracking in the technical use of the word. Those 2 days or 5 days or 10 days of fracturing the well, no documented cases of water contamination. But in fact, there are many, dozens and dozens and maybe hundreds of documented cases of water contamination, water pollution from modern fracking, so from the entire process. In January of this year, AP, the Associated Press, published an article that they had been working on for years where they described the number of complaints and then the number of confirmed cases of pollution. And in Pennsylvania alone, in 2013, there were 398 complaints of water pollution. In 2012, there were 499 complaints of water pollution. And in the past 5 years, under probably one of the most pro-gas drilling governors in history in Pennsylvania, there have been 100 confirmed cases of water pollution, and that's in Pennsylvania alone. So I think it's misleading to the public to say that there's no water contamination from fracking when just in Pennsylvania alone there's 100 confirmed cases. And these aren't necessarily from the act of fracturing the well. These are from a spill that might have happened or an accident. They're from people's drinking water wells that may have dried up. They're from a poorly cased well, a number of different reasons why people's wells may have been polluted or otherwise affected. But they're confirmed. The Pennsylvania DEP really resisted giving this information to the AP. It took them years to get it, but it was published in January. Also, there is more evidence than that fracking itself, and now I'm using it in the industry term, but the act of fracturing the well itself may cause groundwater contamination. Duke University is doing a lot of research on this. They published a paper last year that showed that people's drinking water wells that are nearby to fractured wells have a higher amount of methane in the water than drinking water wells that are not near fracking wells. And that's a tough one to get at because there is naturally occurring methane in the groundwater. In the Bergton area where the well was proposed in Rockingham County, people have talked about for years, lighting your well on fire and having methane in the groundwater. That's naturally occurring there. But there's a chemical signature on methane where you can distinguish this shallow, naturally occurring methane that occurs in shallow areas and the deep methane that would only occur from drilling down a mile or two below ground. So these researchers can distinguish between the two types of methane. The methane that they were finding in greater proportions nearby to the wells, to the fracking wells, was the deep methane. So a few of the quotes that you saw are old, or a couple years old, and I think they're going to have to be even more careful about choosing their words in the future as new data does come in. because this has all just been happening in the last few years, and so the research and the science is really catching up with the technology at this point. That's it for my slides. I want to quickly go back to a map I showed. This one. Back to the point about sort of the known impacts, the industrial impacts, and the unknown impacts, which are the questions about water. I don't want to speak for the elected officials that adopted these regulations, that sent their comments to the George Washington National Forest. But many of them were motivated by these industrial impacts. But many of them were also concerned about their drinking water. Most of these communities get their water right off of the George Washington National Forest. 250,000 people in their valley get their drinking water straight from sources on the forest. And so the question that there might be some risk to their water supply if fracking occurs on the forest was something that folks in the valley are really worried about and continue to be worried about. So I showed a lot of dramatic images, I think, of how this affects the landscape. And do I think that this is going to happen to the Shenandoah Valley? Probably not. But do I think it's possible? Yes, I do believe it's possible. It is possible. And so the decisions that we make as boards of directors, as elected officials, as citizens, have to take into account the possibility that this kind of modern fracking could come to the Tidewater area or to the Shenandoah Valley. I think I've got about 5 minutes left. I didn't check the clock right when I started, but in the few minutes that I have remaining, I would like to take off my hat as director of Shenandoah Valley Network and put on my hat as former director of conservation at the Wood River Land Trust. And I held that position for 5 years. And I know there's VOF staff here and a lot of conservation professionals that work on conservation easements and board members of VOF. And we all know that in that kind of work, you spend a lot of time thinking about this vague concept of perpetuity. And what does it mean? What is the world going to look like in 20 years, 60 years, 100 years? And what are the people that come after you in your position when they're looking at approvals on existing easements that you wrote, when they're trying to steward those easements, when they're hopefully not, but someday probably having to enforce the terms of those easements? You're doing your best to write that easement with the landowner in a way that you're going to make the person's job easier down the road. And at the Wood River Land Trust, we never accepted an easement with oil and gas development allowed. And I think that the impact on the impact that would have been a discouragement to that, but also thinking about stewarding an easement with the reserved rights for oil and gas would have been very intimidating to me when that's what I was doing for a living. When we visited when we visited Washington County, Pennsylvania, and talked with the local officials there, one of the most striking things that they explained to us was the disregard that the gas companies there had for the local regulations and the local officials and the local communities. And I'll acknowledge that I believe that there are some good actors. I think there are probably some good gas companies that want to do the right thing, that want to work well with the community, that want to be careful, but there are also decidedly some bad actors too. And when you write an easement or when you write your local regulations, the fact is you have to write them because of the bad actors, not because of the good actors. And so when you hear local elected officials in Pennsylvania talking about just disregard of the regulations and the system of rules set up in the local county, and then and there was very little they could do about it, frankly. And you think about what a land trust would be up against if they're trying to enforce an easement and the gas company disagrees with them. That's certainly a can of worms. If I've tried to imagine a situation in which it would be appropriate to allow oil and gas development reserved rights on an easement, I think that, well, back to considering my former position, I think we would need a very sophisticated program, and we would need some real expertise about the impacts of oil and gas development and some legal expertise in order to even consider that. And we certainly, we did not have that level of sophistication, and I think very few land trusts would want to have that level of sophistication to really make you equipped to do that. So I think I'm going to leave it at that and open it up to questions.
Rick Parrish from the Southern Environmental Law Center. Thank you, Kate, especially for sharing your experiences in the field with us. Those observations are critical. I have a question about one of the impacts that you didn't really dwell on. You showed us pictures of pipeline construction and the environmental impacts of the construction. And you showed a picture of a compressor station, but didn't talk about the impacts to the community, to the residents, of the 20 to 30 years of production that Mr. Ward mentioned would be possible in a good producing well. Did you experience what those compressor stations and pump stations are like?
Yeah, we did. We were able to visit compressor stations in Wetzel County and processing plants in Washington County, Pennsylvania. And maybe in a heavy industrial district of a county, that type of activity might be compatible, but in a rural landscape and farmland, it is just a complete disconnect. It's a heavy industrial process. So really noisy, I mean, the equivalent to jets taking off. There's often flaring that occurs depending on the type of gas, apparently. There's flaring that occurs, so that's this, giant fire coming out. Really bright lights around the clock, industrial impacts. And we asked, we want to understand this. We're not trying to inflate this or make it worse. We wanted to understand it, to take these stories back to the people that we work with in the Valley. And so asked about this question of, yes, the drilling itself is intensive, and it's dirty, and it's loud, and it's industrial, but then they're finished, and what happens? And the answer that we've consistently got from other communities is, well, then they just move right over to the next site. And so the crumbling roads and the truck traffic and the trucks off the road stays the same. When they finish one well, they go to the next well, which is, the next ridge over. So the industrial impacts, I think, persist when modern fracking comes in.
A familiar face for Kate. I'm Megan Gallagher. We've worked together on this issue. Kate, something I thought you might want to address is that in the Shenandoah Valley and the Taylorsville Basin, none of the local governments have actually put oil and gas drilling into their economic development plans or in their comprehensive land use plans. And they are wondering, is it compatible with what's called traditional land uses? And the reason I think, if you'll particularly make this relevant to VOF, in Southwest Virginia, where there is lots of land with split estates, in Renee's communities that her land trust serves, oil and gas drilling, energy extraction may be very traditional. But I wonder if VOF is getting ahead of the communities it's serving with no history of energy extraction and no settled agreement and local or community goals and policies.
Thanks, Megan. The Taylorsville apparently has had a little bit of drilling in the past. Maybe wells weren't productive and were capped. The story, I believe, is the same in the Shenandoah Valley. There have been a few gas wells drilled. There have been several wells drilled, 2 or 3 wells drilled on the George Washington National Forest, but never a producing well. So there's really very little, almost no history of oil and gas development in the Shenandoah Valley. You all know it's a farming area. 4 out of the 5 top ag counties in Virginia are in the Shenandoah Valley. And so, again, I'm glad Megan pointed this out. I should have included this. Part of the reason that the local officials in Rockingham were skeptical and declined to issue that local zoning permit, and I think part of the skepticism in general around the Shenandoah Valley, is that this is a new history. I mean, this is a new economy. It would be a new industry coming in that may not be compatible with farming. There are a lot of questions about how this industrial impact of modern fracking could or could not be compatible with traditional uses of farming. The Valleys also relies on tourism and outdoor recreation, and I think that sort of speaks for itself that those are not compatible. So in trying to imagine whether or not reserved rights for oil and gas development is appropriate in a conservation easement, I think it's perfectly appropriate to consider the culture and the economic history of an area. And if the local economy doesn't have a history of oil and gas development and is not interested in creating an economy of oil and gas development, then I think that should definitely should bear on the decision whether or not to include it.
My name is Bill Fleming, and I'm from Virginia Beach. And I'm up here because I had questions actually about easement issues, since I'm looking for property myself. But I'm also a member of the Economics Club of Hampton Roads, and one of the owners of Pennsylvania General Energy happened to give a talk about 6 months ago, which was very interesting. One of the things that he mentioned, this relates to the idea of contamination of water. One of the things that he mentioned was that the water that they were using, they were putting back into the well because it was radioactive. And nobody I have ever heard talked about the radioactivity issues of water, but that's not related to aquifers. It's related to existing contamination, radioactivity. In Virginia, that's a big deal right now because of Pennsylvania County and the idea of mining uranium. But I was wondering if in your work, have you ever looked at the issues of contamination of water due to radioactivity? The idea that some of these people in Pennsylvania are actually running it through waste treatment plants or water treatment plants is pretty scary. And in my process of looking at properties in Virginia to buy, I've ruled out Pennsylvania County, and I'm not sure about this area. I know that the idea of uranium mining, even in the Fredericksburg area, is real, that there's spots all over the place that have higher concentrations of uranium. So the idea of radioactivity contamination due to fracking is a concern. Have you seen any of that?
Yes, that's a good question. I'm glad you pointed that out. I also failed to include that in my presentation. When you go down a couple miles into the ground, there's naturally occurring radioactive material down there. And when you bring water up that's been down under the ground a couple miles for millions of years, it has some of that can have naturally occurring radioactive material in it. Apparently the Marcellus Shale has a higher proportion of this norm than other geological formations, so it's particularly concerning in the Marcellus Shale. Initially, when this was raised 4 or 5 years ago, when this issue sort of first broke, people thought those crazy environmentalists are scaring everyone by telling them there's radioactive material in the water. Well, it turns out that just last year, new data was published, and it's at the effluent, the outputs of these municipal water treatment plants that initially were taking that wastewater, they're finding high levels of 10 times higher than the EPA standards of radioactive materials nearby to the outlets of these municipal wastewater treatment sites.
My name is Brian Hoffman, live and work here in Fredericksburg, and formerly lived in eastern Ohio, in and around Youngstown, so on the west slope of the Appalachian Mountains. And it seems from this image you have here, it's a mountainous region. All these municipalities chose to not include fracking as an option, and it seems as though this is fairly representative of the rest of the development going on in the Marcellus Shale. But this is very different than the coastal plain and tidal regions that we have here in the Rappahannock and Potomac watershed. In your opinion, would that unique characteristics here call for something such as a interagency review statewide of the projected impacts of fracking?
I'm not sure I exactly understand the question. Certainly the landscape is different. This is a mountainous area, and then the Tidewater, of course, has its own sort of aquifer concerns. Ours is a karst area, so we have certainly concerns about the groundwater. One thing implicit in your question, I think, is a question about DMME and the state's current standards. Is that correct? That maybe we need a better review in Virginia of the impacts?
I just understand there's a longer precedent of this type of activity in the Piedmont and the foothills of mountain areas where there isn't in the Tidewater region.
There is a long history of extractive industries in Southwest Virginia, yes. But this is the Shenandoah Valley, so this is quite a bit north, so we don't have a history. But I think, getting to the point where there's some areas where the culture and the economy is built around oil and gas development is certainly a relevant one. And I also want to make a comment about the state's regulations right now. Again, back to Rockingham County's officials' decision to decline that permit. Part of that was, and I'll be careful not to speak for them, but my impression of that decision was a lack of confidence in the state's process. And the DMME actually, to its credit, just issued an opportunity for the public to weigh in on some new rulemaking on disclosing chemicals for one thing, but it was also broader than that. The state's regulations in general on fracking. And the state's regulations were developed for conventional gas development and some coal bed methane development, and that's DMME's expertise. Modern fracking has a different suite of impacts and a different suite of concerns and risks, and those are not addressed in Virginia's regulations. If you're interested in hearing more about improvements that need to be made to Virginia's regs, Southern Environmental Law Center and attorney Greg Bupert just did an excellent letter that many groups signed on to, asking DMME to look at 15 different ways in which their regulations fall short. Just a quick anecdote about this Bergton permit in Rockingham County, that the DMME approved the permit for this well. Again, it was waiting for an approval from the local county zoning permit, but DMME approved it. The well was in the floodplain of the North Fork of the Shenandoah River. There was no input from the other agencies. The DEQ didn't have a role, DCR didn't have a role, Game and Inland Fisheries didn't have a role, VDOT didn't have a role. When asked what's going to happen if there's a flood, this is right in the 100-year floodplain and a site that floods every few years. We've got images of this well site, which is not a well site, it's a farm, but would have been a well site, under feet of water. The DMME responded that the dilution from the floodwaters would mitigate the impacts or the risks from this highly contaminated wastewater that could have been on the site, and that was not comforting to folks who live downstream from that particular well site. So there were a host of reasons why that permit in particular cast a lot of doubt on DMME's ability to make sure that the public was safe and that natural resources were protected. And so sort of back to the matter at hand, which is VOF's decision on how to deal with this issue in easements, I think reliance on DMME's ability to regulate this and sort of passing the buck to there's a state agency that can take care of this, we don't need to worry about that, should look at that carefully, because DMME has a way to go in Virginia before I would be comfortable living downstream from a well.
Thank you.
Jason McGarvey with VOF. I'm moderating the chat room here.
Okay.
And I just wanted to bring a couple of questions that are coming in from the chat room. The first one I think maybe you've already dealt with. It's just somebody was concerned about the gas flares that burn. Will there be gas flares burning off of the wells? Do they burn all night long? Are there smells associated with these wells? And would fracking wells east of Fredericksburg increase the truck traffic on Route 3 and Route 1? And then the second question, unrelated question, and I'm just going to read this because I don't understand the question, but maybe
Okay.
you all
Okay.
understand. It says, has anyone mentioned the, quote, dirty socks filter disposal? These are usually contaminated with radioactive waste, among other things. Disposal of these waste products is hazardous. And I'll leave it.
The first question is about the specific impacts of drilling in the Taylorsville Basin. And I'm definitely not qualified. I'm probably one of the least qualified people in this room to answer that. But it's become clear to me just from the last 2 hours that nobody really knows what the impacts of drilling in the Taylorsville Basin would be. And so back to one of my initial points about there are some good actors, there are some gas companies that are trying to do the right thing, but what people need to prepare themselves for are the very real bad actors. And so I think many citizens clearly are concerned about what might happen. Truck traffic, water contamination, flaring, all of those things, and I think all of those are fair game to be concerned about because it's clear to me that nobody really knows at this point what the impacts would be. So those are questions that I'll encourage you to keep asking. The second one was about dirty socks, and I don't know anything about dirty socks. Is that for okay, well, I have one anecdote, and Renee apparently hopefully can talk more about the silk socks, but an anecdote from my, and this is beating up on West Virginia a little bit maybe, but maybe that's allowed. When we were down in the well site, here we go with Sarah, there were the socks, like, you know how you have silt fencing around to keep sediment out of a creek on a construction site? Well, these workers at this drill pad that we visited had clearly they were socks, the silt socks that had done their job. So they collected all the silt and sediment from washing down, and then apparently these guys emptied them out in this creek downstream to use them again. So that's not answering the question about radioactive materials in the silt socks, but that is an anecdote about how those can be used not effectively at all. Recycling, that's right. Reuse, even better. Yes, sir.
My name is Les Stanley. I'm from Caroline County. And the question I have, you've talked a lot about the impacts, and one that I haven't heard, and something that West Virginia was facing at one time, and I wanted to see if you've picked up any of this in any of your research or talking with local officials, is that their landfills were being overrun with waste from fracking. And the state actually said that localities could not refuse that waste because they were being overwhelmed by it. So I wanted to know if you could maybe share a little bit more about that, or you know anything about it.
Unfortunately, I don't know much more than what you just said. It was in the paper this week, I think, that West Virginia just had some new rulemaking. I don't know if you know more about it, Renee. But in addition to this issue of what to do with all this contaminated wastewater, there's also an issue to do with what to do with contaminated, I guess they're called drill cuttings, or the solid stuff that comes out. And that can, again, there's the radioactive material, heavy metals, stuff that's down underground that probably should stay underground, and what to do with that solid waste, and whether it goes to landfills, and if the landfills have the proper lining to protect the groundwater from runoff from this stuff. These are all questions, and I don't know much more than that, other than it's something to be aware of. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
Kate, thank you very much. My pleasure. And now I think what we'll take is, we're a little bit early, which is nice, and we'll take a lunch break for 1 hour. And then we'll come back and have Renee, our next speaker. Okay? Thank you.